December 15, 1944. The transport truck rattled through the iron gates of Camp Green Lake, Wisconsin, carrying 37 German women who had learned to expect nothing but cold and hunger. Elsa Hartmann pressed her face against the frost-covered window, watching bare trees pass by like skeletal sentries. She was 21 years old, though she felt decades older. The gray wool uniform she wore still bore the insignia of the Women's Auxiliary Corps, a symbol that now felt like a weight pressing against her chest. Beside her, Marlene Vogel clutched a small canvas bag containing everything she owned in the world. One extra pair of socks, a broken comb, and a photograph of her parents standing in front of their Stuttgart bakery. Marlene's hands trembled constantly now, ever since her capture 3 weeks earlier in Belgium. She had been a typist for a Wehrmacht communications unit, her fingers flying across keys translating orders she never questioned. Now those same fingers shook with cold and fear and something she couldn't name. The truck lurched to a stop outside a long wooden building. American soldiers in olive uniforms stood waiting, their breath forming white clouds in the bitter air. Elsa expected shouting, rough hands, the treatment she had been warned about in training films that portrayed Americans as barbaric and cruel. Instead, a young sergeant with red hair and freckles stepped forward and spoke in careful, accented German. "Welcome to Camp Green Lake. Please follow Corporal Jensen to your barracks. Dinner is at 1800 hours. His kindness felt like a trap. Elsa had learned not to trust kindness. It always came with conditions, with hidden costs. The women filed out of the truck in silence, their boots crunching on packed snow. The barracks were simple but clean, with iron bunks stacked too high and gray blankets folded at the foot of each bed. Greta Lindemann, a stocky blonde from Bavaria who had served as a radio operator, ran her hand along one of the blankets. "It's wool," she whispered. "Real wool. Not that synthetic rubbish. How can they afford this?" As the women unpacked their meager belongings, a new sound drifted through the thin walls. Laughter. American laughter, easy and genuine, coming from somewhere nearby. Frida Klein, who had been a nurse and was the oldest among them at 34, moved to the window. She saw American soldiers playing in the snow, throwing balls of it at each other like children. One of them built a small snowman, complete with a cap made from a tin can. She had not seen men play in 2 years. She had seen them scream and bleed and die, but not play. That evening, as promised, they were led to the mess hall. The room was warm, heated by iron stoves that glowed red. Long tables stretched in rows, and the smell of cooked food made Elsa's stomach clench painfully. They had not eaten properly in days. An American cook, a broad-shouldered man with kind eyes and gray streaking his temples, stood at the serving line. As each woman passed with her tin tray, he ladled soup and placed bread beside it. "Real bread," Marlene whispered, "not sawdust." Then the cook said something that made every woman stop and stare. "Tomorrow night," he announced in broken German, "ice cream for dessert." Elsa looked at him as if he had spoken in an alien tongue. Ice cream. In winter. In the middle of a war. It was impossible. It had to be a lie. Elsa Hartmann had not always been a prisoner. 2 years earlier, she had been a university student in Hamburg, studying literature and dreaming of becoming a teacher. Her father taught mathematics at the gymnasium, and her mother played piano for the church choir every Sunday. Their apartment overlooked the Ulster Lake, and in summer they would walk along its shores eating ices and discussing books. That life felt like it belonged to someone else now. The recruitment officer had come to the university in spring of 1943, her uniform crisp, and her smile practiced. "The fatherland needs its daughters," she had said. "Not to fight, but to serve. To free our men for the front by taking over vital communications work." Elsa had signed the papers that same day, swept up in speeches about duty and honor and protecting the homeland from enemies who wanted to destroy everything German. Her mother had cried, but her father had stood proud. "You are doing what is necessary," he told her. "That is what matters." The training had been rigorous, but not unkind. Elsa learned Morse code and radio protocols, how to encrypt messages and maintain equipment. She was stationed in France, in a chateau that had been converted into a communications hub. For months, she translated intercepted messages and coordinated supply routes. She told herself she was helping to end the war faster, to bring the men home. She never asked what the messages contained. She never wondered where those supply trains were going. The other women in her unit became like sisters. Marlene with her constant jokes that kept spirits high. Greta, who could fix any broken radio with just wire and patience. Frida, who mothered them all, making sure they ate enough and slept when they could. They played cards in the evenings and sang songs from home and pretended the war would end any day now. Then came the retreat. The Americans and British pushed deeper into France, and suddenly the war was no longer something happening elsewhere. It was explosions in the night, and orders barked in panic, and packing essential equipment onto trucks while burning everything else. Elsa's unit fled east, but they moved too slowly. The Americans caught them at a crossroads outside a village whose name Elsa never learned. There had been no battle, no dramatic last stand, just soldiers with rifles surrounding their convoy and an officer saying in perfect German, "You are now prisoners of war, you will not be harmed." She had expected much worse. She had been taught that the capture meant unspeakable things. Instead, they were given water and loaded onto trucks and driven to a port. Then came the ship across the Atlantic, crowded and cold but not cruel. And now Wisconsin. Now a camp with wool blankets and warm buildings. Now a cook who promised ice cream. Elsa lay on her bunk that first night, staring at the wooden slats above her. She thought about her parents, wondering if they even knew she had been captured. She thought about Hamburg, hoping it still stood. And she thought about ice cream in December, an impossible thing that challenged everything she had been taught about her enemies. The barracks settled into uneasy silence as darkness fell over Camp Green Lake. Elsa could hear the breathing of 36 other women, each lost in her own thoughts, her own fears about what morning would bring. Outside, the Wisconsin wind howled against the wooden walls, finding every crack and gap to whisper through. She pulled her wool blanket tighter and was surprised again by its thickness, its warmth. In the bunk below, Marlene whispered prayers in the dark, words their mother had taught them both as children. Greta lay rigid on her bunk across the narrow aisle, eyes open and staring at nothing. Frida moved quietly between the beds, checking on the younger women the way she had checked on wounded soldiers in field hospitals. Some were crying softly into their pillows. Others simply stared. All of them waited for whatever would come next. At 2200 hours, the barracks door opened. Every woman tensed, breath-catching. A young American guard stepped inside, no older than 19 or 20, with dark hair and nervous eyes. He carried something in his arms. "I am sorry to disturb," he said in halting, heavily accented German. "The stove, it goes out at midnight. I bring extra blankets." He moved down the center aisle, placing folded blankets on empty bunks where the women could reach them. His hands shook slightly as he worked, and Elsa realized with surprise that he was afraid of them. This boy with a rifle slung over his shoulder was frightened of 37 unarmed women. When he reached Elsa's bunk, he set down a blanket and met her eyes briefly. "You need anything, you knock on door 3 times, he said. "Guard comes." His German was terrible but earnest. "You are safe here, nobody hurts you." After he left, the women lay in stunned silence. Finally, Greta spoke from her bunk. "Did you see his hands? He was shaking like a leaf." "Maybe he has never guarded prisoners before," Marlene offered. "Or maybe," Frida said slowly, "he sees us as people, not enemies. That is what frightens him." The idea hung in the cold air. Elsa thought about the recruitment officer who had signed her up, how she had spoken of Americans as monsters who would destroy German culture and civilization. Yet the men she had seen today looked like the boys from her neighborhood in Hamburg, young faces far from home, doing what they were told, probably just as confused about this war as she was. The extra blanket lay at the foot of her bunk. Elsa reached down and pulled it up over herself, the additional warmth immediately welcome. Through the window, she could see stars emerging between clouds, the same stars that shone over Hamburg. She wondered if her parents could see them too. She wondered if they knew she was alive. She wondered what tomorrow would bring, what this promised ice cream meant, what kind of place would give desserts to prisoners in winter. Sleep came slowly, but when it finally arrived, it was deeper and warmer than any sleep she had known in months. The next evening arrived with the weight of anticipation that none of the women would acknowledge aloud. They had worked through the day on assigned tasks, simple things like folding laundry and organizing supplies in the quartermaster's shed. The American guards had been polite, almost apologetic about giving them work at all. Now, they filed into the mess hall, and for dinner, the same routine as the night before. The cook with gray-streaked hair smiled at them from behind his serving station. "Tonight we have beef stew," he announced in his broken German. "Is good. Very hot." The women moved through the line in silence, accepting their portions with mumbled thanks. The stew was thick with vegetables and chunks of actual meat, more than Elsa had seen in a single meal since before the war. She sat at one of the long tables with Marlene and Greta, eating slowly to make it last. Around them, American soldiers ate at their own tables, their conversations a buzz of English that sounded strange and rhythmic to her ears. Then something happened that made the entire hall go quiet. The cook emerged from the kitchen pushing a metal cart. On top of it sat a large metal container, frost coating its sides. He began moving between tables, and as he reached the first group of German women, he lifted the lid. Steam, or perhaps it was frozen vapor, rose into the air. With a large scoop, he deposited a pale mound into a small bowl and set it before the first prisoner. "Vanilla ice cream," he said proudly. "Made fresh this morning." One by one, he served each woman. When he reached Elsa's table, she stared at the bowl placed before her as if it might vanish like a dream. The ice cream was perfectly white, smooth, with tiny flecks of vanilla bean visible throughout. Marlene picked up her spoon with trembling fingers and took the smallest taste, her eyes closed. "Gott, I am Himmel," she whispered. "It is real." Elsa lifted her own spoon, the cold metal heavy in her hand. She had not tasted ice cream since 1941, before rationing made such luxuries impossible even for those who could afford them. The sweetness hit her tongue, and she felt something crack inside her chest. This was not the behavior of an enemy intent on cruelty. This was not deprivation disguised as hospitality. This was genuine abundance, casually given, as if it cost nothing at all. Across the hall, she watched American soldiers eating their own ice cream, laughing and talking as if this were the most normal thing in the world. And perhaps for them it was. Perhaps this country, this America they had been taught to hate and fear, truly had so much that even prisoners could have dessert in December. Greta set down her empty bowl and looked at her hands. "Everything they told us," she said quietly. "Everything we believed. What if it was all lies?" The question hung in the air between them, dangerous and impossible to ignore. Elsa scraped the last bit of ice cream from her bowl and tasted doubt for the first time. Marlene Vogel sat on her bunk that night with a stub of pencil and a piece of paper she had been given for writing letters home. The Red Cross would collect them, the guard said, and ensure they reached Germany eventually. But how could she write the truth? How could she tell her parents, still living in the rubble of Stuttgart if they were still living at all, that their daughter ate better as a prisoner than she ever had serving the Reich? "Dear Mama and Papa," she wrote, then stopped. The words would not come honestly. She could not write that the Americans fed them ice cream. They would think she had lost her mind, or that the letter was some kind of propaganda. She could not write that the guards treated them with kindness. Her father had spent months in a factory making artillery shells, believing his daughter served the fatherland with honor. What honor was there in being captured? What honor in discovering that the enemy was not what they had been promised? Around the barracks, other women struggled with the same impossible task. Greta had started 7 different letters to her brother, crumpling each one after a few lines. How could she tell him, fighting somewhere on the Eastern Front if he still lived, that she slept in a warm bed while he froze in a trench? How could she admit that part of her felt grateful for her capture? Frida wrote steadily, her nurse's practicality guiding her pen. She told her sister in Berlin only facts, that she was unharmed, that the camp was clean, that she was fed regularly. She did not mention the quality of the food or the gentleness of the guards. Some truths, she had learned, were too complicated to fit on paper. Elsa had not even attempted to write. She sat with blank paper before her, pencil untouched, thinking about her father. He had been so proud when she joined the Women's Auxiliary Corps. "Your service honors our family," he had said. But what honor was there in serving a lie? The ice cream had been a small thing, just a dessert, but it represented something larger that she could not quite name. It was proof that everything she had been taught about America was false, and if that was false, what else had been lies? She thought about the messages she had encrypted and transmitted, never asking what they contained. She thought about the supply trains she had helped coordinate, never wondering where they went. Ignorance had felt like innocence then. Now it felt like complicity. Marlene finally wrote something safe and meaningless. Dear Mama and Papa, I am well, and hope this letter finds you the same. The weather here is very cold. I think of you always and pray for your safety. Your loving daughter Marlene. It was true enough but told nothing real. She folded it carefully and set it with the others to be collected. Some letters were better left unwritten. Some truths were too heavy to send across an ocean. Outside, snow began to fall again, covering everything in white, making the world look clean and new, and deceptively simple. Private Thomas Whitmore was 19 years old, and had never expected to be a prison guard. He had grown up on a farm outside Grand Island, Nebraska, where his family raised corn and hogs, and worried about weather and market prices like every other family in the county. He had 2 younger sisters, both still in school, and a mother, who sent him letters every week, filled with news about neighbors and church socials, and the victory garden she tended with fierce determination. He had joined the army expecting to fight, to prove himself, to do something meaningful for the war effort. Instead, they had assigned him to Camp Green Lake to watch over German women who looked more frightened than dangerous. On his 3rd day of duty, he was assigned to supervise a work detail in the supply shed. 6 women, including the tall blonde one named Greta, were sorting through boxes of winter clothing, separating items by size and condition. Thomas stood near the door, rifle slung over his shoulder, feeling absurdly out of place. The women worked in silence, occasionally speaking to each other in rapid German he could not follow. Greta kept glancing at him with an expression he could not read. Finally, she approached and spoke in careful, heavily accented English. "You have photograph?" She pointed to the breast pocket of his uniform where the corner of a picture peeked out. "Most soldiers, they show family." Thomas hesitated, then pulled out the small photograph his mother had sent in her last letter. It showed his whole family standing in front of their farmhouse. His father with his weathered face and strong hands, his mother in her Sunday dress, his sisters grinning with missing teeth. Greta studied it for a long moment, her expression softening. "Your brother?" she asked, pointing to Thomas in the picture. "No, that is me," he said. "This was taken last summer before I enlisted." She looked confused, comparing the boy in the photograph to the soldier before her. "You look very young," she said quietly. "My brother, he is also 19. He fights in Russia. I do not know if he lives." Thomas saw tears gathering in her eyes and felt something shift in his chest. She handed back the photograph carefully, as if it were precious. "Your family, they must miss you very much." "My family too. They are in München. I think maybe the bombs have come there now. I do not know." For a moment they stood in uncomfortable silence, guard and prisoner, enemies who looked at each other and saw only worried children far from home. Thomas thought about his sisters, about how he would feel if they were prisoners in a foreign land. He hoped someone would be kind to them. He hoped someone would see them as people, not just enemies. The other women had stopped working and were watching this exchange with cautious interest. Thomas cleared his throat and gestured back toward the boxes. "We should finish the work, yes?" His German was terrible, but Greta smiled slightly. "Yes, we finish." As she returned to sorting clothes, Thomas stood by the door and thought about his brother comment. She had a brother his age fighting somewhere in the frozen hell of the Eastern Front, and here he stood, warm and safe, guarding her. It happened on a Sunday evening in early January of 1945. The mess hall had been cleared after dinner, tables pushed to the sides to make room for what the camp commander called a morale event. American soldiers filled one half of the room while the German women stood uncertainly on the other side, the space between them feeling vast despite being only a few meters wide. Sergeant Harold Chen, whose grandparents had come from Guangdong province before he was born in San Francisco, pulled a harmonica from his pocket. He had been carrying it through the entire war, playing it in quiet moments when homesickness became too heavy to bear. He began with something simple, a folk melody his grandmother used to hum while cooking. The notes floated through the mess hall, sweet and melancholy. Thomas stood near the back, watching as the German women's expressions shifted from wariness to something softer. Music, he realized, needed no translation. When Sergeant Chen finished, There was a moment of silence before scattered applause came from both sides of the room. Then something unexpected happened. Frida stepped forward from the group of German women, her hands clasped nervously in front of her. "May I?" she asked in halting English. "May I sing?" Captain Morrison, the camp commander, nodded his permission. Frida's voice rose clear and strong, filling the hall with a German lullaby that mothers had sung to children for generations. Her eyes closed as she sang, and Elsa saw tears on her cheeks catching the lamplight. When Frida finished, the Americans applauded, and something in the room had changed. The barrier between the two groups felt less solid, less absolute. Private Jackson, a tall soldier from Louisiana, began singing a spiritual his grandmother had taught him, his deep voice rich with emotion. Then Marlene offered a Christmas carol, and Greta followed with a folk song from Bavaria. Back and forth it went, German and American voices taking turns, each song a small offering of shared humanity. Sergeant Chen played his harmonica between songs, and someone found a guitar that had been gathering dust in the recreation room. Private Kowalski, whose parents had come from Poland, played chords he had learned from his father. The music became a conversation without words, saying things that English and German could not bridge. Elsa found herself humming along to melodies she did not know, swaying slightly to rhythms that felt both foreign and familiar. Beside her, Marlene had tears streaming down her face, though she was smiling. "When did we forget that they were human too?" she whispered. "Or did we ever know?" The evening stretched on until the camp commander finally announced that it was time for lights out. As the women filed back to their barracks, Elsa heard Greta humming one of the American songs, her voice soft but carrying in the cold night air. Thomas stood guard duty that night, and through the thin walls of the barracks he could hear the German women still humming, still singing quietly to themselves. He pulled out his harmonica and played along. Frida Klein had seen things that haunted her sleep. As a nurse attached to Wehrmacht units in Poland and later France, she had tended wounded soldiers with hands that became steady through necessity. She had learned to ignore screams, to work through exhaustion, to make impossible choices about who might be saved and who was beyond saving. But there were other things too, things she had glimpsed at the edges of her service that she tried not to understand. Convoys of trucks heading east, filled with people who were not soldiers. Camps she was forbidden to enter where smoke rose day and night. Wounded men who woke from anesthesia screaming about things they had been ordered to do. She had told herself these were rumors, exaggerations born from the chaos of war. She had focused on her patients, on the immediate work of suturing wounds and administering morphine, and writing letters for boys too injured to hold a pen. She had survived by keeping her world small, by seeing only what was directly in front of her. But now, in the recreation room of Camp Green Lake, American newspapers lay scattered on tables. The guards read them during breaks, and they did not hide them from the German prisoners. Frida approached one of the tables on a gray January afternoon, her heart pounding. The newspaper was from New York, dated 1 week earlier. She had learned enough English now to read the headlines. Allied forces discover death camp in Poland. Thousands dead. Evidence of systematic murder. Her hands trembled as she picked up the paper. There were photographs, grainy and terrible, showing emaciated bodies stacked like cordwood. Survivors who looked like living skeletons staring at the camera with hollow eyes. American soldiers standing amid the horror, their faces stunned and sick. She read the article slowly, her English still imperfect but sufficient to understand what was being described. Gas chambers, crematoriums, industrial-scale murder of civilians. Jews, Poles, Russians, Roma. Men, women, children. Millions, the article claimed. Not thousands, millions. The newspaper slipped from her fingers and drifted to the floor. She stood frozen, her nurse's mind trying to process information that seemed impossible, inhuman, beyond comprehension. But she had seen the trucks. She had smelled the smoke. She had heard the screams of soldiers who knew what they had participated in. She had known something terrible was happening. She had chosen not to know the details. Captain Morrison found her there 10 minutes later, still standing motionless, staring at nothing. He picked up the newspaper and looked at the photographs, then at her face. "I am sorry you had to see this," he said gently, "but perhaps it is important that you do." Frida looked at him with eyes that had aged a decade in 10 minutes. "We did this," she whispered. "My country. My people. We did this." She walked back to the barracks in a daze. That night she lay in her bunk and stared at the ceiling, understanding finally why the Americans gave them ice cream and warm blankets and kindness. It was not because they were naive or weak, it was because they were proving they were different. They were showing what civilized people did, even to their enemies. They were demonstrating the difference between the two sides of this war. By the third week of January, ice cream had become routine. Every Sunday evening, the cook wheeled out his metal cart with its frosted container, and the women lined up for their small bowls of vanilla or chocolate or sometimes strawberry. What had seemed impossible now felt ordinary, and that ordinariness carried its own weight of revelation. Elsa watched the ritual unfold each week with a mixture of wonder and growing shame. This was not special treatment for prisoners. This was simply how Americans lived, even in wartime, even in winter. The abundance was casual, unremarkable, woven into the fabric of their daily existence. She had been raised on stories of American suffering during the Depression, of breadlines and poverty that the Reich had supposedly surpassed. She had been told that America was a nation of degenerates, weakened by luxury and racial mixing, unable to withstand the discipline and strength of German will. Yet here she sat eating dessert in a prison camp, while her parents in Hamburg likely went to bed hungry, while German children learned to recognize the sound of approaching bombers, while cities across the fatherland crumbled into rubble. The ice cream tasted like proof of every lie she had been told. Marlene scraped the last bit from her bowl and set it down with a hollow sound. "My father used to dream about opening a second bakery," she said quietly. "Before the war, before everything changed. He would talk about it over Sunday dinners, how he would call it Vogel and Son, even though he only had daughters." She smiled at the memory. "We had enough flour for maybe 2 weeks when I left for training. I wonder if the bakery still stands." Greta stared at her own empty bowl. "In München, my mother would save butter for weeks to make a single cake for Christmas. We thought we were doing well because we had butter at all." She gestured around the mess hall, where American soldiers laughed and talked, where food appeared in quantities that seemed inexhaustible. "They have been living like this the entire war, while we starved and called it sacrifice." Frida, who had barely spoken since reading the newspaper article days earlier, finally broke her silence. "They can afford kindness," she said. "They can afford to be merciful because they have everything else, but it is more than that." She looked at each of them in turn. "They choose kindness. That is the difference. They could treat us as we would have treated them had the war gone differently. Instead, they give us ice cream." The implications of that statement settled over the table like snow. Elsa thought about the propaganda films she had watched during training, the ones that depicted American soldiers as brutal occupiers who would rape and pillage their way through Europe. She thought about the warnings they had received about what would happen if they were captured. None of it had been true. The greatest weapon America possessed was not its industry or its military might. It was this casual demonstration of a better way to live. A better way to treat even those who had been enemies. Thomas walked past their table collecting empty bowls. "Thank you," Elsa said in English. The words felt inadequate but necessary. He smiled. "Welcome," he replied. "See you next Sunday." February brought a thaw that turned the campgrounds into mud, and with it came questions that could no longer be frozen away. The women gathered in their barracks during evening hours, speaking in low voices about things they had never dared discuss before. The newspapers kept coming, each one carrying fresh horrors discovered as Allied forces pushed deeper into Germany and Poland. More camps, more photographs, more testimonies from survivors and liberators alike. The scope of it became impossible to deny or dismiss as enemy propaganda. Greta sat on her bunk with a letter from the Red Cross that had taken 3 months to reach her. Her brother was dead, killed in December outside Budapest. The notice was brief and clinical, offering no details about how he died or where he was buried. She held the thin paper in her hands and felt nothing, then everything, then nothing again. He was 19, she said to no one in particular. He believed everything they told him. He thought he was defending the homeland. Marlene moved to sit beside her, offering silent comfort that words could not provide. How many brothers and sons and fathers had died believing lies? How many had died perpetrating horrors they might not have chosen if they had known the truth? Elsa lay on her bunk, staring at the wooden ceiling and wrestling with questions that had no easy answers. She had not pulled triggers or thrown grenades. She had encrypted messages and coordinated logistics. But those messages had ordered movements of troops and supplies that enabled everything else. Those logistics had kept the machinery of war functioning. Her hands were not blood-stained, but were they clean? Could anyone who had served the Reich claim clean hands? Even those who claimed they did not know? Frida had known, or at least suspected. She had seen the edges of the truth and chosen to look away, to focus on her patience, to survive by staying willfully ignorant, now that ignorance felt like its own form of guilt. Late that night, unable to sleep, Elsa sat up and found Frida already awake, sitting by the window and looking out at the muddy darkness. "Can you forgive yourself?" Elsa asked quietly. Frida was silent for a long moment. "I do not know if I should," she finally replied. "I was a nurse. My oath was to heal, to do no harm. But I served a system that did nothing but harm. I told myself I was helping wounded soldiers, that this was neutral, that healing was always right. But there is no neutrality in evil. By helping some, I enabled all of it." She turned from the window to look at Elsa. "The Americans give us ice cream and treat us with kindness. Do we deserve it?" The question hung in the cold air between them. Elsa had no answer. Perhaps that was the point. Perhaps living with that question, carrying it forward into whatever future awaited them, was the only honest response possible. Outside, a guard walked past on patrol, his footsteps squelching in the mud. Inside, 37 women lay awake with their questions and their guilt, and their gradual painful awakening to truths they could no longer deny. The letter arrived on the first day of March, carried by Red Cross channels that moved with frustrating slowness through war-torn Europe. Elsa's name was called during mail distribution, and her heart seized in her chest. She had not heard from her family since her panned capture 4 months earlier. She took the thin envelope with trembling hands and retreated to her bunk, almost afraid to open it. The handwriting on the outside was her mother's, the careful script she had learned in a different Germany before everything changed. Inside was a single sheet of paper and a small photograph that slipped out and landed on her blanket. The photograph showed her parents standing in front of what remained of their apartment building, or rather, what had been their apartment building. The structure was a hollow shell, windows blown out, one wall collapsed entirely, rubble spilling onto the street. Her mother and father stood amid the destruction, thinner than Elsa remembered, older than they should have been. Her father's face was gaunt, her mother's eyes hollow with exhaustion, but they were alive. They were standing. They had survived. Elsa picked up the letter with shaking hands and began to read. "My dearest Elsa," her mother wrote, "we received word through the Red Cross that you are alive and safe in America. This news brought us more joy than you can imagine. We had feared the worst. Please do not worry about us. The apartment was damaged in the bombing last November, but we have found shelter with the Hoffmans in their cellar." The letter continued with carefully worded descriptions of life in Hamburg. Food was scarce. The ration cards provided barely enough to survive. The city was a landscape of ruins, entire neighborhoods reduced to rubble. People spoke in whispers about defeat, about the war being lost. But no one dared say such things too loudly. Her mother wrote about standing in line for 4 hours to receive half a loaf of bread, about burning furniture for warmth because there was no coal, about the constant sound of Allied bombers overhead and the mad scramble to shelters that sometimes saved lives and sometimes became tombs. Your father still tries to teach, though the gymnasium has no roof anymore. The children sit bundled, in coats learning mathematics among the ruins. He says education is what will rebuild Germany when this is over. Elsa read the letter twice, then a third time, and felt the gulf between her reality and theirs open like a chasm. Tonight she would eat hot stew and fresh bread. She would sleep in a warm bed under wool blankets. She would have ice cream for dessert. And her parents, who had done nothing wrong except live in the wrong country at the wrong time, would huddle in a cellar eating watered-down soup and burning chairs to keep from freezing. She pressed the photograph to her chest and wept. Marlene found her there an hour later, curled on her bunk with the letter crumpled in her fist. "What is it?" she asked gently. Elsa could not answer. How could she explain that love and guilt had become the same unbearable weight, that being saved felt like betrayal? March gave way to April, and with it came news that everyone had been expecting but no one wanted to hear. Germany was collapsing. American and British forces crossed the Rhine while Soviet armies closed in from the east. Cities fell like dominoes. Cologne, Frankfurt, Nuremberg. The wireless broadcasts that Captain Morrison allowed the women to hear spoke of chaos, of refugees fleeing in all directions, of a government and military structure disintegrating before the Allied advance. Each news bulletin brought fresh anxiety to the barracks. What would happen to their families? What kind of Germany would exist when this was finally over? Elsa thought constantly about her parents huddled in the Hoffman cellar. Were they safe as armies fought street by street through German cities? Had Hamburg fallen yet? Would the liberators see them as victims or as complicit citizens of a criminal regime? The questions kept her awake at night, staring at the ceiling while around her other women wrestled with the same fears. On April 12th, President Roosevelt died, and even the German women felt the weight of it. They had seen his photograph in newspapers, read his words about unconditional surrender and post-war justice. Whatever he had planned for Germany's future died with him. Now there was uncertainty layered upon uncertainty. Captain Morrison gathered all the prisoners in the mess hall one evening in late April. His face was grave, his usual warmth replaced by somber formality. "Ladies," he began, speaking slowly so they could follow his English. "The war in Europe is nearly over. Within weeks, perhaps days, Germany will surrender. When that happens, you will have decisions to make about your future." He paused, looking at each face. "The United States will offer repatriation to any who wish to return to Germany. We will also consider applications from those who wish to remain here as immigrants. This will not be easy. There will be investigations, paperwork, sponsorships required. But it will be possible." The barracks erupted in whispered conversations that night. Return or stay, home or exile, the known horrors of a defeated Germany, or the uncertain future in enemy territory that had become strangely familiar. Greta had no family left, her brother dead, and her parents killed in bombing raids months earlier. What was there to return to except rubble and ghosts? Marlene's parents still lived, as far as she knew, but Stuttgart had been heavily bombed. Would they want her back after she had served the regime? Would they understand why part of her wanted to stay? Frida wrestled with duty and desire. As a nurse, she knew Germany would need medical professionals to treat the wounded and sick in the aftermath. But could she face the survivors of the camps, knowing she had turned away from the truth? Elsa held her mother's letter and studied the photograph of her parents standing in the ruins. They needed her. Germany needed everyone who could help rebuild from the ashes, but she had learned things here, seen possibilities for how people could live and treat each other that did not exist. In the Germany she knew, returning felt like duty. Staying felt like hope. How could she choose between them? May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe Day. The announcement came over the wireless in the mess hall where all the women had been gathered. Germany had surrendered unconditionally. The war was over. Captain Morrison stood before them, his expression mixing relief with something more complicated. "Ladies," he said, his voice carrying across the silent room, "you are no longer enemy prisoners. You are free to return to your homeland. We will arrange transport within the next 2 weeks for any who wish repatriation." There was no celebration, no cheers, just 37 women staring at him with faces that showed fear more than joy. That night the barracks became a space of impossible conversations. Women sat in small groups, voices rising and falling as they debated futures they could barely imagine. Greta paced between the bunks, her stocky frame tense with agitation. What is there to return to? Empty houses, dead families, a country that will take generations to rebuild. Here I have learned a trade in the machine shop. Here I can work, earn money, maybe have a life. Marlene sat with her head in her hands, torn between duty and desire. My parents are alive. They need me. How can I abandon them to rebuild alone? But she thought of Stuttgart in ruins, of the hunger and cold her mother had described in letters. She thought of starting over in rubble versus starting over in a country where ice cream in winter was ordinary. Frida spoke quietly but firmly. I am going back. Germany will need nurses, need healers, need people willing to face what we have done and help build something better. I cannot run from that responsibility. Several women nodded in agreement, their faces set with determination. Others looked away, unable to meet her gaze, knowing they were choosing differently and feeling the weight of that choice. Elsa sat alone on her bunk, holding the photograph of her parents. Her mother's hollow eyes stared back at her from the image, accusatory even in their exhaustion. They had survived bombing and starvation and the collapse of everything they knew. They deserved to have their daughter return, to have family intact, to not be abandoned in their hour of greatest need. But she thought about the past 5 months. She thought about Thomas showing her his family photograph, about singing with Sergeant Chen's harmonica, about learning that enemies could become something like friends. She thought about newspapers that printed truth instead of propaganda, about elections where people chose their leaders, about a country where ordinary citizens ate meat and bread and ice cream as if such abundance was their natural right. She thought about the Germany described in her mother's letters, a landscape of physical and moral ruins that would take lifetimes to rebuild. Could she face that? Should she face it? Was staying an act of cowardice or an act of survival? The conversations continued deep into the night, voices rising and falling, tears shed, decisions unmade and remade a dozen times. By morning, each woman would have to choose: return to everything they knew, everything they had destroyed and been destroyed by, or stay in this strange land that had shown them a different possibility for what life could be. The morning of May 20th dawned gray and cool, the kind of spring day that promised rain before evening. 2 transport trucks sat idling outside the camp gates, ready to carry the women who had chosen repatriation to the port in Boston. From there, ships would take them back across the Atlantic to a homeland most barely recognized anymore. Inside the barracks, women packed their few belongings and said goodbyes that felt both final and inadequate. 22 had chosen to return, 15 had chosen to stay. The division had nothing to do with age or rank or where they had come from. It cut across all such simple categories, separating women who had become sisters through shared captivity. Frida embraced Elsa tightly, neither speaking because words felt too small for what they needed to say. Frida was going back to offer her nursing skills to a broken country. Elsa was staying, unable to face the ruins, unable to leave the glimpse of hope she had found here. I will write to you, Frida promised. I will tell you everything. How Germany rebuilds, how your parents fare if I can find them in Hamburg. Elsa nodded, throat too tight to speak. She pressed a folded piece of paper into Frida's hand with her parents' last known address. Please, she managed to whisper, please tell them I am sorry. Tell them I am alive and thinking of them always. Marlene was also returning, her duty to her parents stronger than her fear of what awaited. She held Greta's hands and wept openly. You have been like a sister to me, she said. I do not know if I am making the right choice. I only know I cannot abandon them. Greta wiped tears from her own face. There is no right choice, only the choice each of us can live with. Write to me. Tell me about the bakery when your father reopens it. I want to know that good things can grow in the ruins. Around them, similar scenes played out across the barracks. Women who had survived capture and imprisonment together now faced a parting that felt more permanent than anything the war had imposed. Those leaving carried guilt about abandoning those who stayed. Those staying carried guilt about abandoning their homeland. Captain Morrison stood by the trucks as the women who chose repatriation filed out, each carrying a small bag of possessions and a packet of Red Cross papers. He shook each woman's hand, his face solemn. Go with our hopes for peace, he told them. Help build a better Germany. May you find your families whole and your country ready for renewal. Thomas stood nearby, and when Frida reached him, she stopped. Thank you, she said in English that had become fluent over the months, for treating us like human beings, for showing us what kindness looks like. He nodded, unable to trust his voice. The trucks pulled away slowly, and the 15 women remaining stood watching until they disappeared beyond the gates. Elsa felt Greta's hand slip into hers. They stood together in silence, knowing their lives had just forked onto paths that could never converge again. Behind them, the barracks that had been a prison now felt like something else entirely. Ahead lay an unknown future in a foreign land. There was no comfort in their choice, only the terrifying freedom of having made it. The transformation from prisoner to immigrant happened slowly, in small administrative steps that felt both mundane and momentous. The 15 women who remained were moved from the prison barracks to a converted dormitory on the edge of the camp, a building that had previously housed American administrative staff. They were given civilian clothing donated by local churches, simple dresses and skirts that felt strange after months in uniform or prison garb. Elsa stood before a small mirror and barely recognized herself in a blue cotton dress with white buttons. She looked like someone who belonged to peacetime, though peace still felt like a foreign concept. The paperwork was extensive: immigration applications, sponsorship forms, background investigations, conducted by serious men in suits who asked careful questions about their service to the Reich. Captain Morrison had warned them it would not be easy, that America would not simply welcome former enemy personnel without scrutiny. But he had also assured them that if they were honest, if they demonstrated genuine remorse and commitment to their new country, they had a chance. Elsa sat through her interview and answered every question truthfully. Yes, she had served the Women's Auxiliary Corps. Yes, she had encrypted messages and coordinated logistics. No, she had not known about the camps until capture. No, that ignorance did not absolve her. She carried shame for what she had helped enable, and she would carry it, always. Greta found work at a factory in Milwaukee that manufactured farming equipment, her mechanical skills from radio repair translating well to industrial machinery. She rented a small room above a bakery run by a Polish immigrant family who had fled the war themselves. They understood something about starting over in a strange land. Elsa was hired as a translator by the State Department office in Chicago, helping to process the flood of refugees and displaced persons pouring out of devastated Europe. Her fluency in German and improving English made her valuable, and her unique perspective as someone who had been on both sides gave her insight into the complicated emotions of those she helped. She found a boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Chen, Sergeant Chen's aunt, who welcomed her with kindness that felt like family. The other women scattered across the Midwest, finding work and housing and slowly building lives from nothing. Some took classes in English and American citizenship, others learned trades or pursued nursing certifications. They wrote letters to each other, maintaining connections forged in captivity, sharing struggles and small victories. Anna Mueller married Thomas Whitmore in a small ceremony in Nebraska, his family accepting her with warmth that made her weep. She helped on the farm and learned to love the endless cornfields that reminded her nothing of Bavaria. Several evenings each week, the women who remained nearby would gather at someone's room or apartment. They spoke German together, cooked foods that reminded them of home, and talked about the letters they received from those who had returned to Germany. Frida wrote regularly from Hamburg, her letters describing the massive reconstruction efforts and the difficulty of facing survivors of the camps. "The work is hard," she wrote, "but necessary. Someone must do it." Marlene sent cheerful notes from Stuttgart about helping her father rebuild his bakery, though Elsa could read exhaustion between the lines. Summer 1965. The invitation had arrived 3 months earlier, printed on heavy cardstock with careful lettering. "You are cordially invited to a reunion at Camp Green Lake, now decommissioned, to commemorate the 20th anniversary of the end of the war in Europe." Elsa held it in her hands, now the hands of a 41-year-old woman, and felt the years collapse between then and now. She had become an American citizen in 1950, married a history professor named David Henderson in 1952, and raised 2 daughters who spoke English without accents and knew Germany only through their mother's carefully curated stories. She had built a life, a good life, but the girl who had arrived at Camp Green Lake in winter felt like someone else entirely. The day was bright and warm when she drove through the gates, David beside her, their daughters in the back seat asking questions about this place their mother rarely discussed. The camp had been converted into a community center, the barracks now meeting halls and recreation spaces, but the bones of it remained, and Elsa felt memory wash over her with physical force. There, the mess hall where ice cream had shattered her certainties. There, the barracks where she had wrestled with impossible choices. There, the fence line where she had watched trucks carry away the women who chose differently. She saw Greta first, heavier now but with the same direct gaze, standing beside a tall man who must be her husband and 3 children who had her blonde hair. They embraced like the sisters they had become, tears flowing freely. Anna arrived with Thomas, both of them weathered by prairie sun and hard work, their 4 children ranging from teenagers to a toddler. One by one, the others appeared. 9 of the 15 who had stayed, gathered again, after 20 years of scattered lives. They set up tables under the shade of oak trees and laid out food, American dishes and German ones mixed together without thought. The children played together, speaking English, and knowing nothing of the war that had shaped their mother's choices. Captain Morrison arrived, retired now, and gray-haired, but with the same kind eyes. Sergeant Chen came with his wife and children. Thomas's sisters brought pies. The afternoon unfolded with laughter and stories, with photographs passed around showing lives built from ruins. And then, incredibly, Frida appeared. She had returned from Germany for a medical conference and detoured to Wisconsin when she heard about the reunion. She embraced each of them, and they wept together. The division of 20 years ago healed by time and understanding. Marlene could not come, her letter explained. Her health was poor and travel impossible, but she sent love and memories and photographs of the bakery, rebuilt and thriving. As the sun began to set, they gathered around tables, laden with food, and there, impossibly, miraculously, the cook who had served them ice cream in winter appeared, retired and elderly but still recognizing the women he had fed 2 decades earlier. He brought ice cream, they served it in small bowls, just as they had in 1944, and the women who had been prisoners tasted it again and remembered everything they had survived, everything they had chosen, everything they had become.